You remember the last time you explained yourself when nobody asked. It wasn't weakness, not insecurity, in the clinical sense the word carries now. It was a reflex so old you'd stopped noticing it was happening. The explanation that came before the question existed. The story you told to contextualize a choice that didn't owe anyone context. The defensive tone that showed up in a conversation that had no attack in it. And you only noticed after. Always after. And there's a second that follows every time. The second when you realize you said too much. That you justified what needed no justification. That you handed someone who never asked the job of approving what was already yours. That second has a specific texture. An internal silence that isn't peace. It's the recognition that you did it again. The thing you told yourself you were done doing. There's a point where it stops. Not a decision you make on a Tuesday afternoon. Not a resolution. Not a phrase someone said that changed everything at once. It's something that happens on the inside, quietly, after years of carrying the weight of an audience that was never real. And whoever has reached that point recognizes it not by what they started doing, by what they simply stopped needing. There are 7 signs, not achievements to be celebrated, not targets to pursue. They're what shows up naturally in someone who has crossed that point without noticing exactly when. And the first is the most visible of all, but rarely the first to be named clearly. You stopped explaining your choices. There was a time when every significant decision came with a briefing, not a written one, a verbal briefing, available on demand, for anyone who showed enough interest or skepticism to deserve the full version. Why you chose that path and not another. Why you left the job everyone thought was good. You don't have children, or have so many alive with, or don't live where everyone seems to think you should. The briefing was always ready, and you delivered it, often before anyone asked, before anyone had even shown the faintest sign of questioning anything. What was behind it wasn't dishonesty. It was a quiet belief that the choice, on its own, wasn't enough. That without explanation it was exposed to the judgment of anyone with an opinion and enough free time to express it. So you protected the choice with context, with history, with the logic that made it defensible in front of a tribunal that was never convened and, most of the time, wasn't even paying attention. Epictetus was born into slavery. He had no control over his own body, over where he stayed, over what was demanded of him, and he built an entire philosophy around a single question: what is yours, and what isn't? What is within your control and what lies outside it? He placed other people's opinions firmly in the second column, not because those opinions didn't exist, not because they produced nothing, but because giving them the power to validate or invalidate what is yours means handing control of your most intimate territory to someone with no authority to occupy it. When you stop explaining your choices, it's not because you became arrogant. It's because you understood that the choice already contains the justification, that living in accordance with what is yours is the only answer any question about it deserves. You still explain when you want to, when the explanation serves someone who matters, when it builds something real, when it's a gesture of intimacy rather than defense. The difference is that now it's a deliberate choice, not a conditioned reflex. And there's a second sign that operates at a quieter level, one that has nothing to do with what you say, but with what happens inside you when the other person simply doesn't respond. Other people's silence no longer moves you. You sent a message and got no reply, or you got a cold response when you were expecting warmth, or you shared something that mattered and the person on the other end simply moved on without pausing, without registering the weight of what you'd brought. And for a long time, what followed those moments was a kind of internal audit, a reassessment of how you'd presented yourself, a search for the variable that had produced that silence. Maybe you'd said it the wrong way. Maybe you'd chosen the wrong moment. Maybe you'd asked for too much. Because other people's silence carried information. It had the power to reorganize what you thought about yourself based on an absence, on a look that never came, on a recognition that stayed missing. And that reorganization happened before you decided it would. It was automatic. It was the operating mode of someone who had built their sense of self with material that came from the outside. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire and documented in the Meditations, in writing that was never intended to be read by anyone but himself, the constant work of not letting the internal state depend on what arrived from outside. Not as as daily work, as the most demanding task precisely because it never finishes, because the external stimulus always arrives, and the question is always the same. What do you do with it? When other people's silence stops moving you, it isn't indifference, it isn't coldness. It's that the center of gravity has shifted. It's no longer out there, dependent on confirmation, on response, on recognition that has to travel from outside to inside. It's here, steady enough that an absence is just an absence, not a verdict about who you are. But there's a specific moment inside a conversation, not before it and not after, where this second sign gets tested more directly, where the old impulse still shows up, harder to ignore than any silence received from a distance. You leave conversations without needing the last word. The last word has a very specific function. It closes things. It ensures that the version left in the air is yours, not theirs. It's the proof for yourself that you didn't walk away defeated, and for a long time, not having the last word was an incompleteness that lingered after the conversation, a feeling that something had been left unfinished, a kind of open tab that needed to be closed before you could move on to anything else. The impulse to have the last word isn't about convincing the other person. That becomes clear at some point. The other person rarely changes their position because of your last word, and you've known that long enough for it to no longer be a surprise. The impulse is about something different. It's about not leaving an interaction feeling smaller than you entered it. It's the ego needing to register that it was present until the end, that it didn't yield the field, that it didn't let the other person's version be the last thing occupying the space. Seneca wrote about the cost of small battles, about how the energy spent on quarrels that produce nothing, on disputes with no real winner because what's being contested has no real value, comes from the same reservoir as everything that actually matters. He wasn't describing resignation. He was describing economy, the decision not to spend what is finite on what is trivial. When you leave a conversation without the last word, two things become visible that were hidden before. First, what the other person thinks about how that exchange closed is their problem, not yours. Second, leaving before the end isn't losing. It's choosing where to put what's left of the day, the week, the available attention. The conversation is over. You're still whole. If this third sign reached you, you don't need to explain it to anyone, but write the number 3 in the comments. Just that. You no longer feel the urgency to convince anyone. You had a perspective, and the other person had a different one. And there was a time when that automatically created an internal task. Bring the other person to where you were, with arguments, with evidence, with the right story, with a logical sequence that made disagreement seem irrational. And when they didn't move, you tried from another angle. And when they still didn't move, there was a frustration proportional to how much you'd invested in the attempt, as if their resistance was a problem with your reasoning, when most of the time it was simply a person who didn't want to move. What was underneath that wasn't intellectual arrogance? It was a belief that shared reality required agreement, that if someone saw things differently, one of you was wrong and the natural resolution was convergence. And if convergence didn't come, something had failed. The logic, the communication, the relationship, something was incomplete. Epictetus said that trying to change the opinion of someone who doesn't want to change is like trying to change the weather with willpower. You can want to, but the mechanism isn't available to you. What's always available is your response to the weather, never the weather itself. When the urgency to convince disappears, what takes its place isn't passivity. It's a clarity about where your effort produces real results and where it vanishes without a trace. You share what you think when you want to share it, when there's genuine openness, when the exchange has value in itself, but the need for the other person to reach the same conclusion in order for the exchange to have been worth it, that need is no longer there. And with it goes an amount of energy you'll notice the first few days. Then you'll notice where it went instead. If you watched the video about people who drain your energy, you'll recognize this from a different angle. Because the urgency to convince and the urgency to be approved have the same root. When Juan goes too. But the fifth sign is where the recognition gets most precise. Because it requires something most people consider harder than any silence, than any last word, than any argument left unmade. You changed your mind in public without feeling ashamed. You said something, and then realized you were wrong. And the gap between realizing and admitting used to be long. Not because you were dishonest, not because the truth didn't matter to you, but because changing positions in public seemed to carry a concrete, immediate cost. The cost of looking like someone who doesn't know what they think, who shifts, who lacks the steadiness to hold what they've defended. So you defended it a little longer, or you found a way out where the subject died without it being formally registered that you'd switched sides. Or you simply let the silence cover what had been said before. That isn't weakness of character. It's the natural operation of an ego that learned consistency is credibility, that changing is losing, that the public version of you needs to be stable and coherent even when the internal version has already moved, has already seen more, has already understood something the earlier version didn't yet know. Marcus Aurelius changed positions in the Meditations with a frequency that surprises careful readers, not across volumes published at different points in his life. Within the same text, he revised what he'd written, contradicted what he'd asserted, arrived at conclusions that undid earlier ones, in a text that, again, was never planned to be read by anyone. What that reveals isn't inconsistency. It's the portrait of a mind that considered truth more important than the appearance of having arrived at it without error, without deviation, without the human process of actually thinking. When you change your mind in public without feeling ashamed, it isn't because you stopped caring what people think. It's because you discovered that the person who admits they were wrong carries more real authority than the person who defends until the end what they no longer believe. That public correction is a gesture of integrity, not weakness. And that the people who matter, the ones with the capacity to recognize what they're seeing, know the difference. Of those 5 signs, how many did you recognize in yourself? Write the number in the comments. Not what you want to be, what you already are. The opinion of people who don't know you stopped hurting. There was a kind of comment that arrived from angles you didn't expect. From someone who saw you once in a specific situation and drew a permanent conclusion. From someone who doesn't know what you carried to get where you are, but has a formed opinion about where you should be instead. From someone who will never know the details that made a decision inevitable or necessary or simply the only honest one available at that moment, and who evaluates it anyway as if context were optional and judgment sufficient. And that hurt in a way that was hard to name precisely, not always, because of the criticism itself, which was often too shallow to have its own weight, but because of the feeling of being seen incompletely and having no way to correct that picture without giving up things that weren't for that conversation, without delivering intimacy to someone who hadn't earned it, without turning your own defense into a briefing that depended on the approval of whoever started the attack. Seneca wrote that the wise person doesn't need external approval to know what they are, not because they're insensible to what others think, not because they carry some special armor against outside judgment, but because they have access to information the other person doesn't. What actually happened, what actually motivated it, what it actually cost. And that information is enough. The opinion of someone without access to it is, literally, an opinion about someone else, about a version that doesn't exist, assembled from the pieces that were visible from a distance. When the opinion of people who don't know you stops hurting, it isn't because you closed yourself off. It's because you understood that it has no authority to touch what is real in you. That the judgment of someone without the context can't be a verdict about someone who has it. That the weight it carried came from you accepting it as valid, and that you can simply not accept it, not as a defense, but as the recognition that the court has no jurisdiction. It still shows up sometimes. A comment arrives, and you feel something for a second, but the second passes, And what used to stay for hours or days disappears now before it can settle. That's the difference. And the seventh sign is the quietest of all. No audience, no social test, nobody to confirm anything. It's what happens when you're alone and no one is checking. You're fine, even when nobody's watching. There's a version of you that only exists fully when there's a witness. Not dishonesty. It's a pattern so common it's rarely recognized as a pattern. The productivity that increases when someone can see you working. The calm that's easier to maintain when someone's nearby to observe it. How much you enjoy what you're doing that feels sharper when there's someone to tell how much you're enjoying it. The generosity that flows more easily when it's going to be noticed. Not because you're performing any of those things, because the outside gaze works as an amplifier for internal states that still need confirmation to feel real. And there's another side to this pattern, subtler and more revealing. How okay you are with who you are when no one is checking. Where's no conversation, no validation, no outside who you are. When it's just you with what you did, with what you're doing, with what you didn't do, and with the quality of the silence that follows. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations without an audience. No intended readership, no planned publication, no imaginary reader to impress or to demonstrate the consistency of his thinking too. It was a man alone with the quality of his own thoughts. And what he recorded in those moments wasn't the polished version for outside consumption. It was the real examination, the honesty that only appears when there's no stage, when there's nothing to gain from the performance. When you're fine, even when nobody's watching, it doesn't mean you no longer value connection, doesn't mean company has lost its worth, doesn't mean you found some superiority in solitude. It means your well-being stopped being a function of other people's gaze. That the calm you feel when you're alone is recognizable is of the same nature as what you feel when you're with others. That you don't need an audience to exist in a fully real way. And that, of all 7 signs, is the hardest to fake. We can, by definition, look at what these 7 signs have in common. None of them are about building something new. None of them require acquiring a skill, developing a trait, becoming a better version of something you aren't yet. All of them are about what stopped, what ceased to be necessary, what got let go along the way, without ceremony, without announcement, without the dramatic moment that transformation usually promises it's going to have and almost never delivers in the form the promise described. You didn't wake up one day needing to prove nothing. You woke up one day and realized it had already been a while since you'd been proving anything. That the briefing had disappeared without a departure date. That other people's silence had gotten smaller. That the last word had stopped feeling urgent. That the opinions of people who don't know you had lost the address they used to arrive at. This is the difference between what Stoicism calls wisdom and what the world tends to call self-awareness. Wisdom isn't an arrival with a fixed date. It's the delayed recognition that you had already crossed something without noticing exactly when. And whoever recognized even one of these 7 signs in themselves is further along than they think. Write in the comments, I'm there. Not as a declaration that it's over or that there's nothing left to cross. As the recognition that you're no longer where you were. Seneca wrote, do not seek outside yourself what you can find within. Most people spend an entire life looking in other people's eyes for the confirmation of what was already here all along.